Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. When officers pulled her from the water, her hands were blistered, her hair smelled like gasoline, and she was carrying someone else's ID. But it wasn't just the name on that license that made detectives pause. It was who she used to be to him. This is the story of Tomas Calavera Jr. and the woman who set fire to more than just his truck. December 23, 2024. Port O'Connor, Texas. At approximately 6:14 a.m., a utility worker traveling down a coastal service road reported what looked like a fire near the parking area by Powderhorn Lake. Emergency units arrived minutes later to find a late-model 2024 GMC Sierra fully engulfed in flames. The vehicle was unoccupied. By the time the fire was extinguished, the truck was almost completely gutted, interior melted, VIN partially scorched. The license plate was unreadable, but a partial serial from the engine block was enough for a quick match. The vehicle belonged to Tomas Donald Calavera Jr., age 30, of Bazar County. What raised concern wasn't just the arson. It was the presence of a burned woman found less than 100 yards away, pulled from the marsh shoreline by responding deputies from Calhoun County. She had visible burns on her hands and forearms, smelled strongly of accelerant, and was found lying beside a partially deflated kayak with a single dry bag. Inside that bag, a lighter, a partially melted phone, a wallet containing Calavera's ID, and a toddler's baby photo. The woman identified herself as Faith Page Goins, 40, and claimed she was camping near the coast. Her story unraveled immediately. No camping gear, no supplies, no tent, and a torched vehicle registered to another man whose name she was carrying. At the time of detainment, she was not under arrest, but she was placed on a medical hold for second-degree burns to both hands. Deputies filed a suspicious incident report and secured the truck's remains for arson examination. Detectives from the Calhoun County Sheriff's Office requested background on Calavera, only to discover no missing persons report had been filed. At least, not yet. Later that afternoon, 3:57 p.m. A request for a welfare check was initiated by a patrol sergeant in Bazar County after contact with Calhoun officials. Tomas's phone had pinged off a cell tower in Seadrift late the previous night. Deputies visited Calavera's residence at Gunsight Pass Drive, a suburban neighborhood just outside San Antonio. The home was a one-story duplex with two vehicles in the driveway, none of them the burned GMC. Lights were off, blinds closed, no signs of forced entry. After no response and with consent from family who had been contacted by Calhoun investigators, a deputy breached the backsliding door. The home was quiet, no struggle, no blood, no overturned furniture. The thermostat was still running. A toddler's toys sat in the living room, undisturbed. In the master bedroom closet, under a pile of clothing, officers located a male body. He had been shot once in the face at close range. He was identified by tattoo and dental record as Tomas Calavera Jr. Time of death was estimated between 10 p.m. on December 22nd and 2 a.m. on December 23rd. Initial observations: no defensive wounds on the victim, no signs of ransacking, no shell casing found at the scene, suggesting cleanup or use of a revolver. There were no forced entries or broken locks. The bedding was intact. The closet door had been shut. It wasn't the scene of a home invasion. It wasn't spontaneous street violence. This was an intentional, targeted killing, and someone had enough composure after the fact to transport the victim's truck 160 miles to the coast and set it on fire. The question investigators began to ask wasn't just who would do this, but who would know how to hide it. Forensic entry point. Chapter 1. Focus. This chapter centers on vehicle forensics and initial scene integrity. Truck fire forensics. Port O'Connor. Residue test confirmed gasoline accelerant. Burn patterns showed multiple ignition points, suggesting premeditation. Melted rubber residue on the kayak suggested it had been stored close to the truck before the fire. Body discovery. Gunsight pass. No blood visible outside the closet. One clean gunshot wound, right cheek to occipital exit. Lack of shell casing and powder spread indicated contact or near contact range. The body was discovered at 4:21 p.m. on December 23, 2024. It was found inside the master bedroom closet of Thomas Calavera Jr.'s home on Gunsight Pass Drive in a quiet neighborhood of West Bexar County. He'd been shot once in the face, point-blank range. There was no forced entry, no sign of a struggle, nothing broken, nothing ransacked. Just a man, concealed beneath a pile of clothes, killed inside his own home. And someone had taken the time to shut the door behind them. The house itself was silent. The thermostat was still running, set to 71 degrees. Holiday decorations remained untouched in the front window. The Christmas tree hadn't yet been put up. Inside the kitchen sink, there were 2 glasses with water residue. On the table, a single baby bottle sat unopened. There was no chaos. But to trained investigators, that kind of calm was suspicious in itself. Deputies secured the home and called for the CSU team. The shell casing was missing. That stood out immediately. The entry wound suggested a small caliber round fired at close distance, consistent with a contact or near-contact discharge. No blood was visible in the living room, hallway, or kitchen. The body showed no defensive wounds. The initial conclusion? He hadn't seen it coming. They checked the doors. Nothing was pried open. The locks were intact. Only the back patio door showed signs of manual unlock from the inside. That detail narrowed the suspect pool to just a few people. Either Tomas had let someone in willingly, or the person was already inside. Detectives began mapping the timeline. The last known communication from Tomas was a group text from a coworker sent at 9:02 p.m. on December 22nd. He didn't reply. His phone remained idle, connected to the home's Wi-Fi until about 3:41 a.m. when the signal dropped. The router log confirmed the disconnect. At 3:45 a.m., the ignition on Thomas's 2024 GMC Sierra was triggered. The vehicle's onboard infotainment system logged the startup, destination input, and route tracking. The address entered was a boat ramp off Maple Street in Port O'Connor, over 150 miles southeast. That data alone wouldn't have meant much if not for the truck's Bluetooth sync. The system automatically paired with a device labeled Page's iPhone. That device had previously been paired with the truck on multiple occasions in the weeks leading up to the murder. At the time of ignition, the truck showed it had only one device connected, and that phone stayed linked until the vehicle reached its final destination, then disconnected at approximately 6:12 a.m. The truck was found in flames 2 minutes later. Attempts were made to erase the vehicle's route history, twice. Both failed due to lack of cellular connection. The person behind the wheel likely didn't realize that deletion commands would only take effect once the system reconnected to OnStar. The logs remained unaltered. Investigators had everything they needed. Inside the truck, accelerant residue consistent with gasoline was found in the bed, on the back seat, and on the driver's side door panel. The interior had been torched in multiple locations, suggesting the fire wasn't caused by accident. It was executed with intent. Meanwhile, in Bexar County, officers searched Thomas's home for additional clues. A laptop in the bedroom showed no recent activity. The home security system had been disabled manually. There was no footage from the night of December 22nd or the early hours of the 23rd. No external cameras were found. But officers retrieved a door sensor log. The front door never opened. The only registered exit was through the back patio at 3:44 a.m. 1 minute before the truck started. The data was aligning, but as one detective noted later in his report, the data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Still, every new digital layer pointed toward the same reality. Tomas had died in his own home, while his child slept in the adjacent room. Then, in the early morning hours, someone calmly collected the truck keys, loaded the vehicle, and drove over 2 hours through dark rural highways before setting it on fire. Whoever did it wasn't panicked. They followed a plan. And yet, the plan had already begun to unravel, starting with the woman found burned and barefoot near the kayak that morning. Investigators now needed to determine what was her relationship to Tomas Calavera and what exactly had happened inside that house. Because no matter how tightly timed the actions appeared, there were gaps, subtle, silent gaps, waiting to be filled with the one thing arson couldn't destroy: motive. By the evening of December 23, 2024, Thomas Calavera Jr. was no longer a missing man, nor just a name attached to a burned-out truck. He was now the center of a homicide investigation, and detectives needed to understand more than the forensics. They needed to understand who he was. Tomas was 30 years old, Born and raised in San Antonio, he had no criminal record, no known enemies, and no active court disputes. According to employment records, he'd worked as a diesel mechanic for nearly 8 years, most recently at a small but respected auto shop off Bandera Road. He wasn't wealthy. He didn't own any properties beyond the small home he lived in, but he was stable, reliable, described by his employer as someone who showed up every single day, on time, no complaints. He had one child, a 2-year-old daughter, born from a relationship that didn't legally exist on paper. That relationship was with Faith Page Goins, a woman who had shared his home, shared parenting duties, and by most accounts, shared a volatile dynamic that was visible only in glimpses. The first thing that stood out in the background check was the lack of police calls to the residence. No documented domestic disputes, no protective orders. That would typically indicate a low-risk household, but neighbors painted a different picture. Over a span of 6 months, 2 different households on Gunsight Pass had noted raised voices on several occasions, arguments that seemed controlled but sharp. Nothing physical, no reports filed, nothing illegal, just tension, noticeable in passing, but never explosive enough to call the police. One neighbor said, "We'd hear it sometimes at night, not screaming, just tight talking, like someone was pressing on a bruise you can't see." What concerned investigators more than the tone of the relationship was the pattern of isolation. Thomas had once been close with his sister and mother, both of whom lived within 30 minutes, but had significantly reduced contact in the past year. His co-workers said he stopped hanging out after shifts. One described it as pulling away from everything except his kid. Detectives reached out to his immediate family. They confirmed what records suggested. Tomas had become distant, more cautious with who he brought into his life. He hadn't said much, but his mother recalled him once mentioning trying to keep the peace for the baby. He didn't elaborate. In cases like these, subtle indicators often speak louder than loud events. There were no restraining orders, no bruises, no emergency calls. But there was emotional containment, which is harder to prove and harder to survive. Victims of low-grade domestic coercion rarely leave evidence. Instead, they adapt, justify, and minimize until they no longer can. Tomas wasn't someone who fit a victim profile on the surface. He was physically strong, financially independent, and, based on the autopsy, healthy and sober at the time of death. The toxicology screen was clean. The autopsy noted no signs of prior injury, no struggle, no restraint marks. The bullet had entered just below the right eye socket and exited through the rear base of the skull. The shot placement was deliberate, one shot, execution style. For investigators, that narrowed the psychological profile of the killer. This wasn't a panic shooting. It wasn't the result of an escalated argument. It was controlled. And the person who pulled the trigger didn't rush afterward. They had time to change clothes, remove the casing, select what to take, and drive. Evidence retrieved from the scene included the 2 water glasses in the sink, a folded baby blanket on the couch, and a phone charger missing from the master bedroom. The charger was later located in the kayak bag recovered with the burned woman in Port O'Connor, along with Tomas's wallet and 2 baby photos. That discovery raised a new dimension. Whoever left that house didn't just want to destroy evidence. They brought personal items, which suggested possession, familiarity, or guilt, possibly all 3. Investigators reviewed banking activity. Tomas's accounts showed no irregularities. No cash withdrawals, no signs of financial stress. There were no purchases of firearms, fuel containers, or high-volume cleaning agents. Nothing suggested he anticipated conflict or was planning to leave. His last debit card transaction was on December 22nd at a convenience store near his home. $9.47 for snacks and toddler juice. It wasn't a man preparing to disappear. It was a man planning for another day of being a father. And that part wasn't lost on detectives. There was a crib in the spare room, toys in the hallway, a half-packed diaper bag in the kitchen. There were things left in a home by someone who fully expected to return to it. The forensic findings painted a clear image. Thomas died at home, likely sometime between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m., by someone who knew his habits, his layout, and most importantly, his comfort level. He had no reason to fear anyone who entered that home, which meant the killer didn't need to force their way in. They just needed him to trust them enough to stay relaxed. The woman pulled from the marsh near Powderhorn Lake had second-degree burns on both hands extending up to her forearms. Her clothing, charred along the sleeves and midsection, was soaked with brackish water and reeked of gasoline. She was transported to a local hospital under a medical watch, but not under arrest. At that point, investigators couldn't charge what they couldn't yet prove. She gave her name as Faith Paige Goins, 40 years old. No outstanding warrants, no prior violent offenses. She identified herself as a resident of San Antonio and admitted without prompting that she had been in Port O'Connor for a short trip. When questioned about the burned truck, she said she had seen smoke and came closer out of curiosity. Asked about the contents of her kayak, specifically the wallet and photos belonging to Tomas Calavera Jr., she replied that she had found them near the shore. What she didn't know was that deputies had already confirmed the VIN on the destroyed vehicle matched the registration address she shared with Tomas. She also didn't know that her phone, partially melted, had just been forensically linked to the truck's infotainment system at the exact time of ignition and GPS route start. This wasn't a random encounter with a burning vehicle. This was someone leaving a digital fingerprint every step of the way. Goins's injuries were examined by a trauma nurse who documented burns consistent with a sudden flash flame event, likely due to a gas vapor fire. The skin patterns were irregular, showing uneven exposure, indicating accidental contact with the ignition source rather than long-term proximity to heat. There were no signs of self-defense wounds and no blunt trauma. However, when examined under UV-enhanced imaging, her right hand showed traces of petroleum-based accelerant embedded beneath the epidermis, an element consistent with fire-setting activity. The burn pattern on her clothing also raised questions. The damage originated at the lower cuffs of the sleeves and climbed upward, rather than from chest or lower leg exposure typical in bystander injuries. Additionally, residue from melted synthetic fiber was later recovered from the driver's side floor mat of the GMC Sierra, fibers that matched the weave and chemical composition of her shirt. The physical evidence contradicted her version of events, but the contradictions didn't stop there. Once stabilized and transferred into sheriff's custody, Goins gave an initial written statement. She claimed she had left San Antonio late on December 22nd after an argument, deciding to clear her head at the coast. She admitted she hadn't told anyone, hadn't packed a bag, and hadn't reserved any lodging. She could not explain how she ended up in possession of Tomas Calavera's wallet, nor why the truck she discovered was the same model and color he owned. She said the kayak was borrowed from someone she couldn't name. Detectives noted that the kayak was registered to a local marina but had been taken without checkout logs. The marina owner confirmed the craft had been left unsecured the night before, meaning it had been taken opportunistically. That detail supported one conclusion. The kayak was not part of the original plan. Something had gone wrong. Investigators cross-checked fuel purchases along the GPS route. Surveillance footage from a 24-hour station in Refugio County showed the GMC Sierra stopping at 5:27 a.m. A woman exited the driver's side wearing a dark jacket and gloves, walked into the convenience store, and purchased a single Bic lighter and a bottle of water. The footage was time-stamped, less than an hour before the vehicle was torched. The transaction was completed using a debit card later confirmed to belong to Tomas Calavera Jr. The forensic case was closing in, but investigators still lacked one critical piece, a full confession. So far, Goins had offered no admission, only vague denials. Her silence on key points was consistent with legal awareness. She refused to speak further without an attorney, and by the time she was formally arrested for arson, she had already been transferred to a secure facility in Calhoun County. At that point, the DA's office authorized preliminary charges, arson with intent to damage property, pending autopsy results from Bazar County. Homicide charges were not yet filed, but internally, investigators were already working under the assumption that they had their primary suspect. They just needed the forensics to keep confirming it. By December 26, 2024, 3 days after the body of Tomas Calavera Jr. was discovered, investigators turned their attention towards something less tangible than forensics: behavior. At this stage in the case, physical evidence had already drawn a tight perimeter. The accelerant, the GPS logs, the surveillance footage, and the clothing fiber match, none of it pointed to random violence. The act was personal, quiet, and controlled. So investigators needed to ask, what did the behavioral history between Tomas and Faith Paige Goins actually look like beneath the surface? Tomas's employer described him as dependable, skilled, and reserved. He rarely talked about his personal life, but one coworker remembered a specific detail. Tomas often rushed out as soon as his shift ended. He never stayed for beers, never joined for after-work gatherings. When asked why, he once replied, "I've got to be home on time. It's easier that way." That wasn't damning on its own. But investigators heard the same sentiment echoed from multiple sources: family, friends, even neighbors, who had observed Tomas slowly but consistently withdrawing from social circles over the past year. He didn't cut ties with people, he just stopped showing up. No restraining orders, no domestic violence reports. But emotionally, the pattern suggested constraint. Detectives weren't looking for dramatic outbursts or criminal history. They were mapping pressure, control, and isolation. And that's harder to document, but no less real. Goines had a background that didn't include major red flags. However, in 2019, she had been involved in a civil dispute in a neighboring county over a property matter that turned combative. In those court filings, opposing parties described her behavior as unpredictable, defensive, and quick to escalate. The matter didn't involve violence, but it did suggest a pattern, control framed as justification. One of Thomas's relatives, who had not spoken publicly until this point, gave a voluntary statement. She described an incident months earlier where Thomas had seemed tense during a family gathering. When asked what was wrong, he said something simple but revealing: "She doesn't like when I stay too long." That moment stuck with her. Now it made more sense. Law enforcement didn't rush to judgment. They knew that behavioral profiles could mislead if taken without corroboration. But when paired with physical evidence and timeline alignment, they painted a more complete picture, not just of the crime, but of the months leading up to it. The toddler, just 2 years old, was placed in the temporary care of Thomas's sister while Child Protective Services processed the emergency guardianship. Inside Tomas's house, the child's bedroom remained untouched. The mobile above the crib was still spinning when officers entered the room. A home set up for stability had turned into a crime scene overnight. Faith Goines, now facing formal arson charges and being held in Calhoun County Jail, had yet to respond to a single detail of the investigation. She requested an attorney. That was her right, but it also meant that what happened between her and Tomas in the final hours would have to be reconstructed not through her account, but through evidence and the life Tomas left behind. Sometimes, motive isn't written in a diary or spoken in a voicemail. Sometimes it lives quietly in a pattern of unmet needs, forced silences, and subtle fear. What Tomas said the least about may have ended up costing him everything. The official autopsy report for Tomas Calavera Jr. was released by the Bazar County Medical Examiner's Office on January 2, 2025, 10 days after his body had been discovered. It confirmed what investigators already suspected, but it also closed critical gaps in the forensic sequence that had held back the formal homicide charge. Tomas had been killed by a single gunshot wound to the face. The bullet entered just below his right eye, exited through the occipital bone at the rear of the skull, and struck the interior wall of the closet behind him. That wall, upon further search, had a small impact fracture consistent with a low-velocity projectile, specifically a .38 caliber round. There were no signs of struggle, no abrasions on the hands or arms, no defensive wounds. Toxicology was clean. Tomas had no alcohol, sedatives, or narcotics in his system. The time of death was estimated between 10:30 p.m. and 2 o'clock a.m., narrowing the gap investigators had been working with. The bullet, recovered from the closet drywall during secondary scene processing, was sent to the Southwest Regional Ballistics Lab. It was later confirmed to be a lead-round nose .38 caliber, fired from a short-barrel revolver. No casing was recovered at the scene, consistent with the firearm type. The nature of the wound was telling. Based on gunpowder residue patterns around the facial tissue and bone entry point, the shot had been fired at contact range, meaning the barrel was either touching the skin or within an inch. That detail mattered. It ruled out distance-based confrontation. It suggested control, intimacy. Either Thomas never saw it coming, or he trusted the person enough to let them get that close. Investigators re-examined the closet space. Tomas had been placed under a hanging rack of clothes. His body was partially concealed by a pile of winter garments, and the door had been pulled mostly shut. The position of the body and the composition of the space meant the scent of blood was masked. The thermostat had been left on. No decomposition odors had been noted by the responding officers during the initial welfare check, despite the body sitting for several hours. This again pointed to staging, not just murder but cleanup. The intent was to delay discovery, buy time, and it had worked. The revolver used in the killing was never recovered. Searches of the coastal area in Port O'Connor were expanded to include the marshland near the kayak recovery site, but no weapon was found. Divers were called in to sweep shallow inlets. The assumption was that the gun had been discarded into open water, likely within an hour after the fire. By that point, the tide had shifted, complicating retrieval. As of this writing, the firearm remains missing. Still, the investigators no longer needed the weapon to proceed. The bullet, the entry wound, and the medical examiner's conclusions confirmed homicide by close-range firearm discharge. Combined with the GPS, surveillance, and accelerant evidence already in hand, the autopsy completed the foundation prosecutors needed. On January 4, 2025, the Bazar County District Attorney's Office filed a first-degree murder charge against Faith Paige Goins. A motion for transfer was submitted, and Goins was extradited from Calhoun County to Bayard County Jail 2 days later. Bail was denied. This marked a turning point in the case. What began with a burned truck on the coast had now been built into a methodical, evidence-backed narrative of premeditated homicide. But one question continued to circulate among the team. Why shoot someone at point-blank range, hide their body in a closet, drive 160 miles to burn their truck, and then try to escape by kayak? What kind of logic follows that chain of decisions? For some investigators, it wasn't about logic. It was about control through silence. The scene hadn't been chaotic. It had been calculated, efficient, like someone who wanted things to disappear without attention. And when they didn't, the fallback was fire. Faith Paige Goins was officially charged with first-degree murder on January 4, 2025, 10 days after the discovery of Thomas Calavera Jr.'s body. The arrest warrant issued by the Bazar County District Attorney's Office cited overwhelming forensic evidence, detailed autopsy conclusions, and a confirmed digital trail that placed her in control of the victim's vehicle in the hours following his death. The formal language on the charging documents was brief, clinical, and precise, but the case behind those lines had already rattled 2 counties. On January 6th, Goins was transferred from Calhoun County Jail to Bayard County custody under high-security escort. No press coverage was allowed at the handoff point. Law enforcement cited security concerns and the ongoing need to protect the integrity of pretrial evidence. Her intake records listed visible burn scarring on both hands, healing abrasions on the knees and forearms, and no signs of psychological distress. The motion to deny bail was immediate and granted. Prosecutors presented a brief but well-structured argument: flight risk, obstruction of evidence, and risk of reoffense. The judge agreed. Goins would remain in jail pending trial. From a legal perspective, the state's position was solid. The murder charge was not based on speculation. It was backed by physical, digital, and testimonial layers that had been cross-referenced and confirmed. Prosecutors already had the recovered bullet ballistically matched to a .38 caliber weapon, autopsy findings confirming close-range execution, GPS data, and ignition logs from the burned vehicle, surveillance footage of the accused purchasing a lighter with the victim's debit card, clothing fiber residue consistent with arson, inconsistent statements made by the accused. While the weapon remained unrecovered, the absence of the gun was no longer a barrier. The case was no longer about finding new evidence. It was about building a timeline that proved intent and making it airtight. The prosecution team assigned 2 experienced assistant district attorneys to the case, both with a background in domestic homicide trials. Their strategy, at least in preliminary hearings, avoided dramatic claims. They leaned entirely on what could be proven: movement, motive, opportunity, and concealment. But behind closed doors, they were aware of what made this case unusually difficult to explain in public narratives. There was no clear event that triggered the killing. No confrontation, no money owed, no custody dispute, no reported abuse. There was no singular moment that could be pointed to as the why. So instead, they focused on the how. Faith Goins had the means. She had the knowledge of the home's layout. She had access to the vehicle. She had prior presence in the truck's Bluetooth logs. She had Thomas's debit card. And most of all, she had no explanation for any of it that held up to scrutiny. In the court of public opinion, the case was still forming. Local media had begun limited coverage, citing it as an unusual case of domestic homicide followed by calculated destruction of evidence. Tomas's family declined interviews. Faith had retained a private defense attorney known more for negotiation than litigation. Public records revealed that Faith Goins had never held a firearms license. She had no registered weapon in her name, no criminal record involving violence. But none of that absolved her. Prosecutors didn't need a past. They needed a provable act of murder, and they had it. The evidence was aligned. But the community, shaken by the brutality cloaked in silence, was left with a larger discomfort. How many more Tomas Calaveras were out there, quiet, unseen, and vulnerable in plain sight? By the time December 2024 faded into the archives of Basar County's worst headlines, the name Tomas Calavera Jr. had become a symbol of silent suffering, an ordinary man whose life ended violently in the place he once called home. And while the public's attention had briefly flared like the flames that consumed his body and vehicle, it was what remained after the fire, after the arrest, after the chaos, that revealed the true weight of the crime. Faith Paige Goins had been taken into custody on December 28, 2024, following her attempted escape via kayak through Braunig Lake. Her capture by the Basar County Sheriff's Office marked a turning point in the investigation, but not its resolution. As of July 11, 2025, she remains in custody at the Basar County Jail, charged with first-degree murder and arson. No plea deal has been announced, no trial date has been confirmed, and no confession has ever been made. Legally, the case sits in limbo, indicted but unresolved. But socially and emotionally, the damage had long metastasized beyond the courthouse. By mid-January, the Basar County medical examiner completed the autopsy. Tomas Calavera Jr. had suffered a fatal gunshot wound to the upper torso. The bullet trajectory was consistent with someone standing above or beside him at close range. The damage caused by the fire had destroyed soft tissue detail, but not enough to mask the ballistic trauma. Toxicology revealed no substances in his system. He had not been sedated, drugged, or impaired. This was not a case of self-defense, nor of accidental discharge. The physical evidence suggested deliberate intent and premeditation. Ballistic testing of the suspected weapon recovered from the charred remains inside the vehicle, though severely degraded, showed rifling marks consistent with a .38 caliber handgun. That model was known to be owned by Faith Goins, registered under her name during a brief period when she had worked at a private security firm in 2018. Digital forensics also continued to uncover more damning timelines. Faith's Google account showed searches related to "how long does a body take to burn" and "best ways to hide evidence in a car fire" just days before Tomas's death. An Amazon purchase record from early December indicated the acquisition of 2 canisters of industrial-strength accelerant gel delivered to a P.O. box under her name. Despite these mounting layers of evidence, the legal strategy from her defense remained unclear. Her court-appointed attorney filed a motion in May 2025 for a psychological evaluation, citing possible postpartum-related mood disorders and a history of trauma. The prosecution has opposed the motion, and a hearing on the matter is scheduled for late August. No formal mental illness diagnosis has yet been entered into the record. Beyond the courtroom, the emotional fallout has devastated those close to Tomas. His mother, Teresa Calavera, a retired schoolteacher, has since assumed custody of his 4-year-old son, Mateo. The child's adjustment, as reported by Child Welfare Services, has been slow and punctuated by night terrors, regressions in speech, and intense attachment behaviors. Tomas's younger brother, Anthony, testified at a family court hearing in March that Mateo asked about his father every day. "He doesn't know the details yet," he said, "but one day he will, and I don't know how we're going to explain it." Friends and coworkers described Tomas as gentle, private, and quietly generous. He had worked as a commercial electrician, rarely missed a day of work, and often covered shifts for others without complaint. He had no criminal record, no known enemies, and no documented history of domestic violence. The relationship with Faith, according to multiple testimonies, had been marked by volatility, mostly from her side. She had distanced him from his family, controlled financial decisions, and reportedly threatened self-harm during arguments. But Tomas rarely spoke about it. His silence was part personality, part strategy. He had planned to leave quietly, and that silence may have cost him his life. Local media outlets initially reported the crime as a suspicious vehicle fire before any remains were positively identified. By the time the identity of the victim was confirmed as Tomas, public interest had already spiked due to the unusual detail of the suspect fleeing via kayak, a fact that added a layer of surrealism to an otherwise grim act of domestic homicide. But beyond the headlines, there has been a deeper, quieter reflection among domestic violence prevention advocates. Tomas's death reignited discussions around male victims of intimate partner violence. an often overlooked demographic in public health and criminal justice discourse. According to a 2023 CDC report, approximately 1 in 7 men in the U.S. experience severe physical violence from an intimate partner during their lifetime, but fewer than 1 in 10 ever report it. The case of Tomas Calavera has now been cited in multiple training seminars and academic forums as a reminder that abuse is not gendered in nature. It is rooted in control, escalation, and untreated psychological instability. Faith Goins's history of erratic behavior, emotional manipulation, and isolation tactics mirrors patterns well documented in psychological abuse literature. Yet, because the victim was male and did not present external injuries or make formal complaints, the warning signs were lost until it was too late. At the time of this writing, July 11, 2025, no verdict has been reached. No sentence has been issued. The system has begun its slow work, but it may take another year, perhaps longer, before a jury hears the full account in court. For those left behind, closure will not arrive with a gavel. It will be stitched together over years of therapy, community support, and memory preservation. The ashes from Tomas's vehicle have long been cleaned. The crime scene tape has been taken down, and Braunig Lake has returned to its quiet rhythm, the surface no longer cut by a fleeing kayak. But justice, real justice, extends beyond conviction. It lies in the way we talk about men like Tomas, who suffer in silence. In how we treat warning signs not as isolated emotional outbursts but as potential preludes to violence. And in how we, as a society, respond, not just with outrage, but with education, protection, and empathy. Looking back, I wish I had spoken up sooner. I wish Tomas had felt safe enough to tell someone what he was going through. If there's one thing I've learned from this story, it's that silence, no matter how noble it may seem, can be deadly. Abuse doesn't always leave bruises, and danger doesn't always come with warning signs you can see. We owe it to each other to speak, to listen, and to act before it's too late. What about you? Have you ever ignored a red flag because you didn't think it looked serious, or known someone who seemed fine but you felt something was off? Let me know in the comments. If this story moved you or made you reflect, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, or even why this story didn't sit right with you. Either way, I want to hear from you. And if you found this video valuable, please consider subscribing to the channel so you won't miss the next true story that might open eyes and save lives.